Can you believe we're already on chapter 22? These must be some really short chapters. This is video 9. And so, a monthly tax of 2 gold ducats was imposed on every household in Cornucopia to protect the country from the Ickabog. Tax collectors soon became a common sight on the streets of Cornucopia. They had large, staring white eyes like lamps painted on the backs of their black uniforms. These were supposed to remind everybody of what the tax was for, but people whispered in the taverns that they were Lord Spittleworth's eyes watching to make sure everybody paid up. Once they'd collected enough gold, Spittleworth decided to raise a statue to the memory of one of the Ickabog's victims to remind people what a savage beast it was. At first, Spittleworth planned a statue of Major Beamish, but his spies in the taverns of Showville reported that it was Private Button's story that had really captured the public's imagination. Brave young Buttons, who'd volunteered to gallop off into the night with the news of his major's death, only to end up in the Ickabog's jaws himself, was generally felt to be a tragic, noble figure deserving of a handsome statue. Major Beamish, on the other hand, seemed merely to have died by accident, blundering unwisely across the foggy marsh in the dark. In fact, the drinkers of Showville felt quite resentful toward Beamish as the man who'd forced Nobby Buttons to risk his life. Happy to bow to the public mood, Spittleworth had a statue of Nobby Buttons made and placed it in the middle of the largest public square in Showville, seated on a magnificent charger with his bronze cloak flying out behind him and a look of determination on his boyish face. Buttons was forever frozen in the act of galloping back to the city within the city. It became fashionable to lay flowers around the statue's base every Sunday. One rather plain young woman who laid flowers every day of the week claimed she'd been Nobby Buttons' girlfriend. Spittleworth also decided to spend some gold on his scheme to keep the king diverted because Fred was still too scared to go hunting in case the Ickabog had sneaked south somehow and pounced on him in the forest. Bored of entertaining Fred, Spittleworth and Flapoon had come up with a plan. "We need a portrait of you fighting the Ickabog, sire. The nation demands it." "Does it really?" said the king, fiddling with his buttons, which that day were made of emeralds. Fred remembered the ambition he'd formed the morning he'd first tried on battle dress, of being painted, killing the Ickabog. He liked this idea of Spittleworth's very much, so he spent the next 2 weeks choosing and being fitted for a new uniform, because the old one was much stained by the marsh and having a replacement jeweled sword made. Then Spittleworth hired the best portrait painter in Cornucopia, Malik Motley, and Fred began posing for weeks on end for a portrait large enough to cover an entire wall of the throne room. Behind Motley sat 50 lesser artists, all copying his work, so as to have smaller versions of the painting ready to deliver to every city, town, and village in Cornucopia. While he was being painted, the king amused Motley and the other artists by telling them the story of his famous fight with the monster. And the more he told the story, the more he found himself convinced of its truth. All of this kept Fred happily occupied, leaving Spittleworth and Flapoon free to run the country and to divide up the chunks of gold left over each month, which were sent in the dead of night to the 2 lords' estates in the country. But what, you might ask, of the 11 other advisors who'd worked under Herringbone? Didn't they think it odd that the chief advisor had resigned in the middle of the night and never been seen again? Didn't they ask questions? When they woke up to find Spittleworth in Herringbone's place? And most importantly of all, did they believe in the Ickabog? Well, those are excellent questions, and I'll answer them now. Good, because it didn't sound very believable that he just resigned or retired and disappeared. They certainly muttered among themselves that Spittleworth should not have been allowed to take over without a proper vote. One or two of them even considered complaining to the king. However, they decided not to act for the simple reason that they were scared. You see, royal proclamations had now gone up in every town and village square in Cornucopia, all written by Spittleworth and signed by the king. It was treason to question the king's decisions, treason to suggest that the Ickabog might not be real, treason to question the need for the Ickabog tax, and treason not to pay your 2 ducats a month. There was also a reward of 10 ducats if you reported someone for saying the Ickabog was not real. The advisors were frightened of being accused of treason. They did not want to be locked up in a dungeon. It really was much more pleasant to keep living in the lovely mansions which came with the job of advisor and continue wearing their special advisor robes, which meant they were allowed to go straight to the head of the queue in pastry shops. So they approved all the expenses of the Ickabog Defense Brigade, who wore green uniforms, which Spittleworth said hid them better in the marshweed. The brigade soon became a common sight, parading through the streets of all of Cornucopia's major cities. Some might wonder why the brigade was riding through the streets, waving at them, instead of remaining up in the north where the monster was supposed to be. But they kept their thoughts to themselves. Meanwhile, most of their fellow citizens competed with one another to demonstrate their passionate belief in the Ickabog. They propped up cheap copies of the painting of King Fred fighting the Ickabog in their windows and hung wooden signs on their doors, which bore messages like, "Proud to pay the Ickabog tax," and "Down with the Ickabog, up with the king." Some parents even taught their children to bow and curtsy to the tax collectors. The Beamish house was decorated in so many anti-Ickabog banners that it was hard to see what the cottage beneath looked like. Bert had returned to school at last, but to Daisy's disappointment, he spent all his breaks at school with Roderick Roach, talking about the time when they would both join the Ickabog Defense Brigade and kill the monster. She had never felt lonelier and wondered whether Bert missed her at all. Daisy's own house was the only one in the city within the city that was entirely free of flags and signs welcoming the Ickabog tax. Her father also kept Daisy inside whenever the Ickabog Defense Brigade rode past, rather than urging her to run into the garden and cheer like the neighbors' children. Lord Spittleworth noticed the absence of flags and signs on the tiny cottage beside the graveyard and filed that knowledge away in the back of his cunning head, where he kept information that might one day prove useful. Chapter 23, The Trial. I'm sure you haven't forgotten those 3 brave soldiers locked up in the dungeons who had refused to believe in either the Ickabog or in Knobby Buttons. Well, Spittleworth had not forgotten them either. He'd been trying to think up ways to get rid of them without being blamed for it, ever since the night he had imprisoned them. His latest idea was to feed them poison in their soup and pretend they died of natural causes. Imagine all 3 dying the same night of natural causes. No. He was still trying to decide on the best poison to use when some of the soldiers' relatives turned up at the palace gates, demanding to speak to the king. Even worse, Lady Aslanda was with them, and Spittleworth had the sneaking suspicion she'd arranged the whole thing. Instead of taking them to the king, Spittleworth had the group shown into his splendid new chief advisor's office, where he invited them politely to sit down. "We want to know when our boys are going to stand trial," said Private Ogden's brother, who was a pig farmer from just outside Barronstown. "You've had them locked up for months now," said the mother of Private Wagstaff, who was a barmaid in the Jeroboam Tavern. "And we'd all like to know what they're charged with," said Lady Islanda. "They're charged with treason," said Spittleworth, wafting his scented handkerchief under his nose, with his eyes on the pig farmer. The man was perfectly clean, but Spittleworth meant to make him feel small, and I'm sorry to say, he succeeded. "Treason?" repeated Mrs. Wagstaff in astonishment. "Why, you won't find more loyal subjects to the king anywhere in the land than those three." Spittleworth's crafty eyes moved between the worried relatives, who so clearly loved their brothers and sons very deeply, and Lady Islanda, whose face was so anxious, and a brilliant idea flashed into his brain like a lightning strike. He didn't know why he hadn't thought of it before. He didn't need to poison his soldiers at all. What he needed to do was ruin their reputations. "Your men will be put on trial tomorrow," he said, getting to his feet. "The trial will take place in the largest square in Showville, because I want as many people as possible to hear what they have to say. Good day to you, ladies and gentlemen." And with a smirk and a bow, Spittleworth left the astonished relatives and proceeded down into the dungeons. The three soldiers were a lot thinner than the last time he'd seen them, and as they had not been able to shave or keep very clean, they made a miserable picture. "Good morning, gentlemen," said Spittleworth briskly, while the drunken warder snoozed in a corner. "Good news! You're to stand trial tomorrow." "And what exactly are we charged with?" asked Captain Goodfellow suspiciously. "We've been through this already, Goodfellow," said Spittleworth. "You saw the monster on the marsh and ran away instead of staying to protect your king. Then you claim the monster isn't real to cover up your own cowardice. That is treason." "That's a filthy lie," said Goodfellow in a low voice. Let me try that again in a low voice. "That's a filthy lie," said Goodfellow in a low voice. "Do what you like to me, Spittleworth, but I'll tell the truth." The other two soldiers, Ogden and Wagstaff, nodded their agreement with the captain. "You might not care what I do to you," said Spittleworth, smiling, "but what about your families?" "It would be awful, wouldn't it, Wagstaff, if that barmaid mother of yours slipped on her way down into the cellar and cracked open her skull? Or Ogden, if your pig farming brother accidentally stabbed himself with his own scythe and got eaten by his own pigs?" "Or," whispered Spittleworth, moving closer to the bars and staring into Goodfellow's eyes, "if Lady Islanda were to have a riding accident and broke her slender neck." You see, Spittleworth believed that Lady Islanda was Captain Goodfellow's lover. It would never occur to him that a woman might try and protect a man to whom she'd never even spoken. Captain Goodfellow wondered why on earth Lady Spittleworth was threatening him with the death of Lady Islanda. True, he thought her the loveliest woman in the kingdom, but he'd always kept that to himself because cheesemakers' sons don't marry ladies of the court. "What has Lady Islanda got to do with me?" he asked. "Don't pretend, Goodfellow," snapped the chief advisor. "I've seen her blushes when your name is mentioned. Do you think me a fool? She has been doing all she can to protect you, and I must admit it is down to her that you're still alive. However, it is the Lady Islanda who will pay the price if you tell any truth but mine tomorrow. She saved your life. Goodfellow, will you sacrifice hers?" Goodfellow was speechless with shock. The idea that Lady Islanda was in love with him was so marvelous that it almost eclipsed Spittleworth's threat. I am tired of saying that name, Spittleworth, and then a TH word or an S word comes after it. Eclipsed Spittleworth's threats. Then the captain realized that in order to save Islanda's life, he would have to publicly confess to treason the next day, which would surely kill her love for him stone dead. From the way the color had drained out of the three men's faces, Spittleworth could see that his threats had done the trick. "Take courage, gentlemen," he said. "I'm sure no awful accidents will happen to your loved ones as long as you tell the truth tomorrow." So notices were pinned up all over the Capitol announcing the trial, and the following day an enormous crowd packed itself into the largest square in Chauville. Each of the three brave soldiers took it in turns to stand on a wooden platform while their friends and families watched, and one by one they confessed that they'd met the Ickabog on the marsh and had run away like cowards instead of defending the king. The crowd booed the soldiers so loudly that it was hard to hear what the judge, Lord Spittleworth, of course, was saying. However, all the time, Spittleworth was reading out the sentence, "Life imprisonment in the palace dungeons." Captain Goodfellow stared directly into the eyes of Lady Eslanda, who sat watching high in the stands with the other ladies of the court. Sometimes two people can tell each other more with a look than others could tell each other with a lifetime of words. "I will not tell you everything that Lady Eslanda and Captain Goodfellow said with their eyes." But she knew now that the captain returned her feelings, and he learned, even though he was going to prison for the rest of his life, that Lady Eslanda knew he was innocent. The three prisoners were led from the platform in chains, while the crowd threw cabbages at them and then dispersed, chattering loudly. Many of them felt Lord Spittleworth should have put the traitors to death, and Spittleworth chuckled to himself as he returned to the palace, for it was always best, if possible, to seem a reasonable man. Mr. Dovetail had watched the trial from the back of the crowd. He hadn't booed the soldiers, nor had he brought Daisy with him, but had left her carving in his workshop. As Mr. Dovetail walked home, he lost in thought. He saw Wagstaff's weeping mother being followed along the street by a gang of youths who were booing and throwing vegetables at her. "You follow this woman any further and you'll have to deal with me." Sort of. Let me read that again. "You follow this woman any farther and you'll have me to deal with." Mr. Dovetail shouted at the gang, who, seeing the size of the carpenter, slunk away. That's the end of the chapter. Until Monday, when you'll see what? Video 10.